I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Eamon, the reality is that, as we heard last week, the DPP are looking to bring charges against Christy Kinahan Snr and his two sons, Daniel and Christy Jr. So the Kinahans in prison, in an Irish prison, is something that we're facing or could face very soon. How are we set up to handle this, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, it was something I looked at last week and I kind of discussed it with a couple of people who would have first-hand knowledge of this sort of thing. And the conclusion was they'd effectively be treated as if they were a paramilitary organisation or a dissident group, that they'd be considered dangerous enough to be able to threaten staff members, families, to have, staff members, tracked down or, possibly bribed or threatened or a mixture of both. And that they would be, at that level of danger that they could even have the capability, say, to mount a rescue. I mean, you're talking about not ordinary criminals, people with access to multi-millions of euro worth of assets and cash, and it's not something that hasn't happened before, around the world.
Because, I mean, of course, like Ireland, unlike maybe some other countries in Europe, we have had, and we do have Portlaoise Prison, and the level of security there has been, it's very, very high.
It's the only prison in the country with the designation high security. All the others that you've heard of, the likes of Mountjoy and Wheatfield, the Midlands, they're all considered medium security. And then you have the open prisons, which are obviously they're called low security, the likes of Shelton Abbey. But yeah, so I mean, the difference in Portlaoise is that there's a lot more staff per head of inmate. That there'd be much tighter visiting regime to some extent. Now, this is for the ordinary prisoners who are on the D block. Obviously, which we'll probably get into a bit, some of the dissidents have slightly better regimes. And of course, the main thing is that they have the support of the defence forces who are on the roof as we speak. They're there all the time. And they are under certain conditions. They are given the go-ahead to shoot to kill.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't think people really know that the defence forces are there 24 hours a day in Portlaoise. They're heavily armed. I think it says platoon strength or something. I don't know how many officers or many soldiers that would be.
Yeah, it's probably slightly more than that. But there would be. I mean, there was one time, I know from speaking to old soldiers, like it used to be kind of a 2-month rotation, and which they all particularly hated because it was the high security. They weren't allowed out. They had to stay 2 months in their barracks in Portlaoise. And again, that was, I suppose, to stop them being got at by the IRA. But that has changed to some extent, that the rotation isn't as long. Obviously, there's probably strict protocols in letting people know who's actually on duty in Portlaoise. I'm sure it's relatively, kept quiet, that if people are on duty, it isn't widely advertised across the internal airwaves, I'd imagine, in the army. No. But yeah, look, it brings a bit of punch to kind of the security. And I think that would be for people who are attacking the prison to break in, as much as trying to stop people breaking out if there's
probably
weapons.
Even more so the breaking in, of course, because I think they still have anti-aircraft guns to stop helicopters because we kind of, I don't say we forget about it, but it's out of most people's living memory. The incredible pressure that the prison system came under in the early 70s as the Troubles kicked off. First, obviously, there was a lot of internment up the north, but by kind of the mid-70s, there was a lot of provisional IRA prisoners being housed in Portlaoise. And, it was part of their creed to try and escape.
Yeah, it was their duty as soldiers, as they saw themselves. Yeah, there was a helicopter landed in the exercise yard in Mountjoy. There was definitely, because I remember as a kid, we were driving somewhere with our family, and there was a huge tailback in Portlaoise, and it was a modified truck, had girders welded onto it, and they tried to ram through the gates of Portlaoise. So even today, you see that there's pretty much like, I suppose they're like, again, steel girders half buried into the ground that are designed to stop any large vehicles trying to get through the walls. So I mean, look, it is something that was taken very, very seriously. And I mean,
yeah, I mean, the state was kind of at war at that point. Things changed over the course of the Troubles, where maybe the Provisional IRA took a sort of hands-off approach to some of that stuff. But I mean, there was massive, attempts to break out, including, I think, in 1974, there was a number of prison guards held hostage at one stage. And then there was as well, there was a couple of incidents of bombings as well, where at one stage IRA prisoners let off a bomb to try and get into the exercise yard, and one of the prisoners was even shot dead in the prison.
Yeah, and of course you had Brian Stack, then a prison officer who was murdered in 1984, and that's been pretty much laid at the feet of the Provisional IRA, that killing. So I mean, there's been, I suppose, there was a sense then, I guess over the years, there's been a bit of a standoff between the Republican prisoners and the government, in a sense that, look, we'll recognise you behind bars effectively as political prisoners. You can have your own organisations, you can run your own timetable, you can get your own food sent in. Don't forget, I mean, at one point, E1, 2 and 3 in Portlaoise, which is about, I think, 40 plus cells in each landing. So you would have had close to 150 prisoners at one point. So each landing would have had its own commanding officer. There would have been an overall commanding officer who would deal directly with the governor. So I mean, like normal inmates, if they have an issue, if they want to get out because it's been a family bereavement or a funeral, they make an application to the governor, and it's decided on that. Whereas, if you're part of a paramilitary organisation, you apply to your CO, your commanding officer, who in turn puts it to the prison governor, who then usually grants it, in that sense.
I mean, it was totally because, of course, there was hunger strikes as well in Portlaoise at some point. I mean, not to the extent that they occurred up in the north, but there was IRA prisoners who went on hunger strike. I mean, did we ever officially come to a place where we recognised the IRA prisoners as political prisoners? I'm not fully sure it was, or was it one of these kind of arrangements that was made?
Look, I think it was an arrangement, and the deal was that, it was in the Green Book of Rules for the IRA that you don't bring the war south, in terms of, you're not supposed to shoot Gardaí soldiers or prison officers, and that very much was adhered to. And I think that was then reciprocated in that they were given a certain amount of privileges, and there were people serving, even until recently enough, fairly serious sentences, who would get leave for family funerals or for whatever reason, and they would be honoured. They would come back when they were supposed to come back, and and that was enforced by the paramilitary's own structures as well, because obviously if one of their people didn't come back and went on the run, he was letting everyone else down, and it would stop other people getting their getting their TR, their temporary release.
Yeah, because I mean, they were obviously they were allowed to have a sort of run their own classes, weren't they, the paramilitary prisons? And we talk about, of course, the Kinahans as a highly organised and well-resourced army. But if you look back at those times, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s, I mean, the Provisional IRA were, an absolutely quite a disciplined and structured organisation.
Yeah, I mean, they were an international capable paramilitary organisation. I mean, we saw their ability to carry out attacks, across Europe, in the UK, obviously across Northern Ireland. They were able to kind of use their logistics in the south of Ireland. They were, acquiring whatever they needed in the United States. And we know since the ceasefire, there's been links with South American groups. They acquired their weapons from Libya. I mean, they're a highly capable group. I mean, the likes of the Kinahans, more than, say, Ridwan Taghi, who's been held in a similar style of prison in Holland. They have the money, though, to hire people. I mean, the high security in the Netherlands, they didn't have the army on it until recently, when they realised that there was an escape attempt being planned, and the idea was that Colombian mercenaries were going to take a few quid from Ridwan Taghi to free him from EVB Voigt, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And that was foiled, but they called in the army to try and prevent that. Because I mean, if a heavily armed, well-trained group of paramilitaries turn up, there's not a lot civilian people can do straight away. Even a unit of armed police aren't going to necessarily be able to do a whole lot if you're talking about 3 or 4. I mean, if you have a trained group of 12 or 24, like former soldiers, they can do quite a lot of damage.
In the 90s, obviously, then there was the IRA ceasefires, there was the negotiations, and ultimately there was prisoners released under the terms of the Belfast Agreement. But in that time, Portlaoise remained a very high security prison. But as we sort of went into the 2000s, we started to see a lot more gangland prisoners brought in there. And those gangland prisoners were probably taking up the mantle of being some of the most dangerous people in the system. Obviously, John Gilligan went there ultimately in the 2000s, and he was regarded as a very high security risk.
Yeah, he was extradited back under armed police from the UK, flown in on an Air Corps aircraft back into Baldonnel in 2000. And he got his 20 years or 22 years reduced to 20, and he spent it all in Portlaoise Prison, where the men with guns were on top, and it, again, very much enjoyed the I suppose the concessions that had been won by the political prisoners. I mean, would anyone considered dangerous, very dangerous in terms of gangland were being held there. Dutchy Holland effectively at one point was acting as the officer in command of E4. They were at the bottom rung, while above them, which were at this stage, it was Dissidents, Continuity, IRA, the real IRA, some INLA people was still in prison there, and they were on the blocks above them. Again, they were actually all quite separate, and at some points were even at each other's throats. But again, it was all seen as a way of trying to keep the peace. I remember being told a story how Dutchy Holland would try to get to the prison officer who was bringing the newspapers onto the landing on a Sunday, and he used to try and quickly flick through the Sunday World and kind of let out a sigh of relief if nobody on E4 was getting a mention in case it upset somebody. Right. But they had their own kitchen. They were able to send out for steaks to the local butchers. Stuff would be delivered. There was the famous story about the budgies that were brought in. They had their own TVs.
Well, tell us about the budgies, of course, because...
Well, the various people had budgies, apparently, and there were, when someone would get out, the budgies would get passed on. And this all came out after, if you remember John Daly, the fingerless criminal, again, quite dangerous. He ended up calling the Joe Duffy lifeline from his prison cell, which caused quite a bit of a stir. I think, was it... when the Bradleys was on.
I mean, it was again. The Sunday World had a role. There were people giving out about a Sunday World article, and ultimately to back up Alan Fatpuss Bradley, John Daly rang from his prison cell saying he wasn't fighting with Alan Bradley, and of course his words about the feud were quickly forgotten, because it just became obvious to people, which everybody had known, I suppose, that this guy who was an armed robber and it was an associate of Marlow Highland had a phone in this high security cell and was ringing up Joe Duffy in a sort of excited and squeaky voice, and felt free to do so. And it did spark a kind of maybe that was the first big wave of folks who were in prisons.
And there was well, I suppose it's 2007, so it's the beginning of smartphones. So I mean, there was now all of a sudden a slightly greater urgency that a phone, there was even more things you could do with a phone than previously. So anyway, things moved on, and there was a series of raids. I think on the very first day there was something like 19 phones found on E4 straight away along. And the story came out then there was budgies now, but they were entitled to have those budgies. They weren't smuggled budgies, to be clear. And there were big, flat screen televisions. But I think there was a new governor came in, or certainly there was a new regime installed, obviously on orders from government, and their own kitchen was stripped out, and anything that wasn't standard was taken out. So they were only allowed then after that then your standard TV. But at the time it was seen as a way, any prisoner who could afford it and had earned the right, or was deemed to be well behaved enough could, have their own Xbox or whatever it was, or their own TV. I mean, you can rent TVs in prison and stuff like that if you want a slightly bigger one and you're entitled to it. Well, you certainly could back then.
Yeah.
But I think this kind of, I guess, whatever about, giving some kind of recognition to paramilitaries who might have had some kind of misguided, I suppose, political aspiration, you could make the claim that they weren't actually criminals. Whereas, the likes of John Gilligan and Daly, they're murderous gangsters. Dutchy Holland, a murderous gangster. These guys who were there. Young Trevor Byrne was on that wing, around that time. Brian Meehan was downstairs in the base, and not too long after that, broke his Trappist monk years of isolation and came back up and pretty much took over control until he was later shipped out anyway to Shelton Abbey. But yeah, look, it really laid bare. I think even at that time there was a brand new visitor centre which the Republican prisoners were refusing to use.
Yeah.
So many money had been spent on tightening security, and they were still strip searched. Because that was part and parcel, but their visitors didn't necessarily have to go through the same scrutiny that ordinary people did. So there was all this, orderly prisoners using coffee pots to smuggle in stuff, or how stuff was getting in. It's
of
various
course,
ways.
In this time, the dissidents have, and I don't know if it's the same exact same stuff that the Provisional IRA have had, but they still have a degree of autonomy and certainly some special privileges. I know from talking to somebody there not so long ago, they had a particular gripe with the murals that the dissident prisoners are still allowed to have, or at least up until that point a couple of years ago. He was, very upset about that, said they have these murals, I think, in Portlaoise, and he felt that they shouldn't be getting any special treatment. But they're there's only a handful of them probably left in Portlaoise at this stage.
Yeah, we got some good detail actually just earlier this year about what's going on there. Partly because E1 was being refurbished, and so it turns out that Eamon Dillon, the TD, who apparently has made has for years been going in to visit Republican prisoners, and obviously because of who he is, the grandson of Eamon de Valera, he's accepted by these. The Republican prisoners as an honest broker. So while the refurbishments were going on, the dissidents had to be moved around, and I think there was a little bit of negotiation to ensure that they kept their I suppose privileges that they had, and he was involved in that. But look, you're talking now. Even whatever 5 or 6 years ago, there would have been maybe 35 or 40 dissident prisoners, and you're literally down to almost a handful or just over a handful now, and they're mostly the guys who are serving time for the Peter Buttley murder.
Which is really the remnants of the kind of Alan Ryan, real IRA faction that were mostly Dublin based.
Yeah, and it's and the two leading kind of, I suppose, members would be Edward McGrath and Kevin Brainey. They're both doing life for the Buttley murder. Sharif Kelly is in there as well. You have another, Stephen Hendrick, doing 11 years for guns, explosives, and he's although he's due out fairly shortly. And you have a couple of others, people that were, say, involved in the Buttley murder who acquired phones and stuff like that. And I think some of them could even be out now.
Yeah,
so you're talking 6 or 7 dissidents. So if we go back to the original point about the Kinahans, I think the capability is there now to be able to, I suppose, corral them properly and to limit how much influence they can have in the wider prison population, and also their ability to threaten or to continue committing crimes from inside prison.
Which of course is the big risk, and that's partly the phones, and obviously it annoys people because they don't want to see prisoners updating their Facebook page or whatever from a jail cell. But really, the danger and the damage that gangland criminals can do from within prison, that was made obvious, I think, by Wayne Dundon and some of that gang, because they were obviously ordering murders from their prison cell on contraband phones, and that would be the concern, obviously, with if the Kinahans were to land back in Portlaoise.
Yeah, look, that's the main reason why any prisoner isn't really entitled to have phones. They have their nominated numbers now that they can ring through the official phone, and they get their whatever 1 or 2 phone calls a week, and they have to show in advance, register a couple of numbers. And part of that was to stop vulnerable prisoners selling their phone calls to other inmates so they can make further calls. But look, threatening witnesses is obviously the key one. Threatening revenge on people, ordering more crimes, all of that. Is the key reason why they, to some extent, they have to be held incommunicado. But at the same time, then there's an argument that there needs to be rehabilitation. They have to be able to maintain relationships. Possibly have access to some kind of education systems. They might need to be calling people to set up for a life on the outside when there is at some point they're going to get out. But like, you know, again, it has to be balanced with the rights of other people not to live in fear. I mean, the last thing you want to do is to be, you know, getting a phone call at night from somebody who, you know, is doing time for a crime they committed against you. And you can imagine what some of the, you know, really like nasty crowd sex offenders would do if, you know, if they got the chance.
Yeah, I mean, the rehabilitation thing, from talking to ex-prisoners and some people who've done very lengthy sentences, I mean, you can really understand from their perspective that they would want, a lot of them have kids, and that, you know, they want to keep that relationship going, and that's good for the children and for the prisoner, and then ultimately for society, because people come out with a, you know, most of the people I've ever talked to have come out, have spoken about their kids and trying to make up for them and all that. So you do want that they have access to the outside. Of course, Christy Kinahan and the sons, you know, you would have to be wary, because of course, if in your, and I hope you're finally getting the credit for the first ever Daniel Kinahan articles, are you?
Well, only here. Not in the wider world.
Not in the wider world. But Christy Kinahan was, of course, previously
and
operating from a prison.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Like he's not new to Portlaoise Prison. Like if he is brought back and sent there, it won't be the first time he's been there. And that was something that came out in a Dutch trial. UP Altopost was being done for drugs in Holland. And evidence came out in that court hearing how he was in phone contact with Daniel, who was getting his orders from his dad in Portlaoise Prison, and there was tapes of Christy Kinahan, you know, speaking to UP Altopost and to Daniel, and this is all was used in court in Holland at the time. So it was like hard evidence that here we go, here's a guy who was doing his time, doing his environmental science degree, finishing off, you know, having already done time in Holland himself, which is where he met UP Altopost. So it just shows you like the importance of, you know, the need to curb, you know, gangland criminals, like, you know, serious ones like Kinahan. And the idea then you'd have, you know, possibly all three of them there. And then in that prison already, then you have some people who have pretty much remained loyal, like Patrick Keating and Liam Brannigan. And then I suppose lower down, you'd have, you know, a gunman like Nicky McConnell is there at the minute. How much, you know, whether or not they'll all end on the same landing or not remains to be seen. But I guess the Kinahans would get to choose who's going to share the cells on the same landing. You certainly don't want to go in there unless you've been invited. I
mean, obviously the other complicated thing that the prisons have done is they've sometimes kept prisoners isolated from other prisoners. We've seen people like Fat Freddie Thompson, you know, bring cases to court saying that he's being kept isolated, and the prison service will be giving a defence to say that they can't have him mixing with other people because he causes trouble and they're concerned. You know, obviously the Kinahans would still have rights. I mean, there is a general right for people to get an education, for example, in prison, isn't there?
Yeah, there's all that. I mean, they can access services, you know, whether it's counselling or education, or they can go work in the workshops, or, you know, go to art classes, music classes. I mean, all of that exists,
and they have a right to access it. And
yeah, and they, you know, and you've had some really violent prisoners in the past where. I know we wrote stories about Warren Dumbrell, you know, was a big guy, but like, you know, there was people who were willing to get into a boxing ring and spar with him, which I'm sure was a great outlet and probably save some other inmates or even staff getting attacked. So you can kind of say, well, geez, these guys shouldn't be there, you know, having the time of their life, you know, whatever, like, you know, using the gym. But like at the same time, it probably makes for a smoother running prison. And the whole point is that they're in there and not out here causing trouble. And that's the whole point then, I suppose, of the phones and with keeping, I suppose, curbs on the Kinahans is to stop them being able to run whatever is left that they can still access of their empire. Because I imagine, like, you know, Kinahan Sr. at this point as a money launderer and pretty much a deal broker could still operate from prison and still could, you know, call in favors, bring in influence. I mean, we're going to see some novel defences. I mean, he's probably going to arrive here and try to claim that he's actually, you know, a citizen of whatever country.
Yeah.
And look for a transfer there and to get out of the Irish system. I mean, there's going to be all of this. Remains to be seen. I mean, like at a certain level, we saw with Yeah, Jerry Hutch, like, I think the plan there was that he was a Spanish resident and he was going to apply to serve his time in a Spanish prison if he had been sentenced to. But obviously he was found not guilty by the Special Criminal Court, which, the Special Criminal Court is where the Kinahans obviously will be. And again, that was all down to the paramilitaries and the need to protect juries from people with this, wide-ranging capability to commit more crimes.
And of course, he's not even been charged, and the UAE haven't even accepted any extradition. So there's a lot more complications to go there. Once people get into prison, they tend to want a job in prison, don't they?
Well, I imagine it's something to do. It breaks up the day. You hear all this like, the best job is to get into the kitchen. Obviously, you can have a little bit of extra coffee or toast or whatever it is. I'm sure there's a few perks to working in the kitchen. I mean, we've written stories about, Joe Riley and he's tending his little vegetable patch and all the rest of it, and proselytizing to other prisoners and trying to allow the Jehovah's Witness minister to come into him the way other religions are allowed their own ministers to come in and talk to them. There's bands. I think we did a story one time. We had a little poster of a little in prison boy zone. One of the Bradley brothers was involved in that, if I remember.
Colopes, I think, as well.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, but you get paid, don't they? A very nominal amount for work if they do it. I mean, I can't remember.
It's like €1 or €1.50 or something or less, and it's very much it goes into the tuck shop account. Like there isn't a little cash slip or whatever, so they can buy their Mars bars or their lemon sherbets or whatever it is they like.
So it would be some come down to see one of the Kinahans applying for one of these jobs, but it may yet happen. But it's still a good bit to go, I would think, before.
Yeah, and you wonder, like, how much cooperation. I mean, we've heard all this, from Drew Harris last week. That there's a lot of cooperation going on between various law enforcement agencies. And that I think it was more or less, that like the Americans are going to get the Kinahans, and so it was a bit of a surprise to see that all of a sudden the DPP have now got the Garda file, so that we have something to prosecute if we do get a chance. And I think that could be coming from a place where there might be some, I suppose, regimes that don't want to be seen handing over people to the Americans, but they might hand them over to the Irish or to their own people. So maybe that's a way around that.
Yeah.
Who's to say then, if they get sentenced for something here and it's a relatively short sentence, that it's easier to extradite them to the US from Ireland than it will be from Iran or Dubai or wherever they are, or Bahrain.
That's of course to say that presuming that there's enough evidence on each individual member of the Kinahans, because it's not necessarily all the same. But it's something we're no doubt going to come back to, Eamon. And we'll be keeping an eye on it.
We'll do our best.
Thanks, Eamon.
Thanks. Always a pleasure, Niall.
Thank you.